And bear with me for a moment. All right, welcome everyone. So great to have you all here for the third session of the four-part series featuring Dr. Al Condeluci. My name is Oli Backstrom, President and CEO of SC LifeWorks out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. SC LifeWorks supports people with developmental disabilities to work and participate in the community. I'm greeting you from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I know we have people joining us from across Canada, across Turtle Island, and from various treaty territories, as well as unceded lands. We welcome our friends and colleagues joining us from the Canadian Association for Supported Employment, or CASE, Innovation Lab Community of Practice Partners, as well as our colleagues from Community Respite Services here in Winnipeg and in Manitoba. I'm grateful for the time you set aside for this opportunity to hear about and talk about social capital loneliness, and today, social mapping, building meaningful relationships. I encourage you to be fully present for the next few hours. You won't regret it. Just a note and a reminder to ensure you're muted unless you're asking a question. Though the questions, I think they'll be formatted in such a way that we'll be asking you to type the questions into the chat for the most part today. If you've accidentally unmuted yourself, I might mute you myself, so don't be offended about that. As mentioned in past sessions, Al has graciously allowed us to record these 4 sessions, and these recordings will eventually be made available to you. Typically, I've been able to turn them around within 24 hours and shoot YouTube video to those who have been participating. Once shared, I encourage you to share them with your colleagues as well. And thanks again, Al, for being so generous to let us share your vast wisdom and knowledge too. Very briefly, some context I've talked about elsewhere, but not here in these sessions. We've been leaning into social capital and social mapping because because we obviously think it's important for all of us and for the people we serve. We think the stakes compound, though, for job seekers we support who have intersectional barriers to employment, in addition to having a disability. Intersectional barriers such as social economic status or poverty, being racialized or indigenous, past, present, or intergenerational trauma. All of these dynamics and others can result in compounding barriers in life, including employment. So we think social capital, building a social capital and social mapping is a really integral piece in helping us better overcome those intersectional barriers as well. Al Condeluci has been an advocate, a catalyst for building community capacities, and a leader in understanding social culture since 1970. Al was born and raised in Steeltown, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, home of the Pittsburgh Penguins, who I'm sorry to say may lose tonight to the Winnipeg Jets. We'll see how that goes. Al still makes his home on Condeluci Hill, there near Pittsburgh. Al has emerged as an international leader and consultant on human services and community issues. He speaks annually to national and international audiences, reaching some 15,000 people per year. He's written great books you can find at alcondeluci.com. These books have won praises and awards for their thoughtful approach to culture and community and are now used in many colleges, universities, and in-service settings. I'm really grateful for your willingness to share your time and your wisdom, Al. So please give a warm Zoom welcome to Al Condeluci.
Great. Thank you, Oli, so much for that kind introduction. And welcome back, everyone. Glad that you're able to join us in this voyage, this community engagement voyage that we've been on. This is our third session in 3 weeks. And we started this 2 weeks ago with a focus on loneliness and isolation, right? And we talked about how folks with disabilities specifically, but really how in a general way, loneliness and isolation continue to creep into our culture. For folks with disabilities, the loneliness and isolation has been a part of the devaluation and the institutionalization that people experienced historically in Canada, in the United States, really and around the world. Um, but we also acknowledge that loneliness and isolation um, have become challenges around the world for societies. Um, Certainly in Canada, we've seen the rise of isolation and loneliness doubling in previously measured situations, and same in the United States of America. The pandemic, of course, exacerbated this phenomena by actually forcing us to be isolated from one another and separated out. And every one of us on this call can remember, I'm sure very clearly, the challenging, feel that isolation had in our lives, and how we missed in very primal ways being with and exchanging with people in our lives. Um, but for folks with disabilities, even with the result of the pandemic lessening in our lives, people with disabilities still find themselves in separate, isolated ways. Um, Knowing that many of us on this call have been working in the field in trying to get people connected, get people jobs, get people lifestyles, allow people to have opportunity to engage. And we've been struggling with that goal. That we know that with employment, for example, we still find ourselves, in spite of the passion and energy that professionals bring to that challenge, we still find, upwards to 70% of adults with disabilities unemployed or underemployed in positions that are substandard, economically substandard. And so um, that challenge still is with us. Uh, our second session really got us to focus in on, well, what is the route to a better life? What is the route to getting a job? What is the route to feeling better about oneself? What is the route to address loneliness and isolation? And that is by building relationships, social capital. We introduced social capital in our last session, and we talked about the fact that construct, that sociological construct of social capital, has only really been articulated since the early 1900s. Um, in 1916, an educator in West Virginia of the United States of America introduced that term in the literature, and he applied the term to what led to the success of his students in life challenges, right? And what he articulated, both in research and then, of course, in theory, was that at the core of people having more successful lives was the ability to develop social capital. Now, social capital, as we talked about last week, is the value that you reap through your relationships, and that the typical person has about 150 relationships in their lives where they have social obligation to one another. That is, they feel that if someone that they know asks a favor or requests something, that they have some kind of an obligation to respond to that. And that notion of 150 was from the theory of Robin Dunbar, anthropologist out of Cambridge University in the UK. Um, and so in our session last time, we talked about social capital. What is it? How do you build it? What does it do for you? The impact of social capital. And and now, as we move into our third of our series of 4 sessions, we're going to flip and say, where do you find social capital? How can you build social capital in other places? And and of course, building of social capital is unfold. Excuse me. Building of social capital unfolds in the community. And so our session today is to really think about community, to define it, to map it, to identify those places and spaces where people gather in some solidarity or common in some common agenda, um, and then really begin to say, how might we get people connected to those communities? And so today we're going to really become macro in our focus, right? Because last week we introduced the micro and the macro juxtaposition in our work. Micro is focusing our attention on and providing some interventions with people who we're working to support, right? So really trying to get that person to understand something, maybe develop some skill or enhancement or have some experience that they personally will have that will be useful for them. That's a micro intervention. But a macro intervention where we're turning our attention today is to really think about the community, what's out there in the greater society where people can and in fact engage. And so starting us off is this image that you see, which essentially is kind of like a postogram of community and the various kinds of elements and portals of community, and recognizing that community is this interesting amalgamation of uniqueness, right? And the word community that many of us have in the titles of our organizations, or that we have in, identified in our mission statements. Um, the derivation of that word community, which is a Latin word, means with togetherness. Meaning with, unity meaning togetherness or alignment. So the word community um, basically suggests um, a, a synthesis and a synergy of people moving towards an agenda. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get into some content. And as Oli said in his introduction, at any time as we roll through some content, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat room, and Oli and I will take some pauses in the content to try to get to your questions. As we get toward the tail end of the content, I'll pose some questions to you and ask you to reflect on the question and respond to it in the chat room. And then Oli and I will field some of those reactions. So getting right into the content, this is a quote from Peter Block. And Peter Block is out of University of Cincinnati in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States. He's written extensively about community. He has a wonderful book. It's sort of like a Bible for me. The book is called "Belonging to Community," is the title of the book. Block wrote that book in the early 2000s, which is filled with interesting perspectives on connecting in community. But this quote I found to be, really provocative. Community is the container within which our longing to be is fulfilled. And without connectedness of community, we will continue to choose not to be. And I think what Block is opining on here is this paradox of isolation and connection, right? And when we connect, we choose to be, and in that we fulfill our longing as beings, right? Now, with building of community, from our session last time, we said that there are 4 steps to community engagement and to the building of social capital, right? And that first step is discovering someone's assets or their passions, their interests. We suggested using a cultural profile, which is basically a questionnaire that probes about who people are, what do they care about, what are they interested in. Once we get that information, once we discover people's assets and people's interests, the second step is, where in the community do other people gather who share the same thing or who care about similar issues, right? That notion then of crossing the bridge from where somebody is at with what they care about to where other people gather is the essence of building community. However, there are 2 other steps to this challenge. There's Once we identify the community venue or space or place, the next step then is to understand the social infrastructure of that community group. Next session, we're going to focus in on that. We're going to talk about some strategies of examining the infrastructure and making some assumptions that we can use that will accelerate, if you will, the connection process. And then the fourth step, which we also will cover next week. In fact, we'll spend time on identifying gatekeepers and getting that notion of who can facilitate the first steps of connection into community for people that we support. So these 4 steps are just sort of an outline, kind of an algorithm of sorts to community engagement and to social capital. Okay? So our focus today, however, is on this second bullet, which is the exploration of community. So this notion of community, when we talk about it, the first thing that it usually engenders in people's thinking is space or place, right? That community can immediately be interpreted geographically. Like, I live in Manitoba, or I live in Pittsburgh, or even more focused, I live in McKees Rocks, which is a subcomponent of Pittsburgh, right? And that McKees Rocks is my community. Manitoba might be your community, right? And when we think geographically, there's all the kinds of things that immediately come to mind with defining community. There are roads and there's bridges and there's banks and there's buildings and there's, resources in the community. There's grocery stores and there's cafes and those things are all true. That's one interpretation of community. But community is multiple kinds of places and spaces that we weave in and out of in our daily journey, right? And so community includes, of course, the geography of where we live, but it also includes our family, and it includes our neighborhood. It includes clubs that we belong to and associations that we're members of, and places where we work, and places where we relax and celebrate, right? Those are all manifestations of community. And if you remember last week when we used the image of a sociogram, right? And which was that rounded image that looked, I said it looked like a pizza pie, right? And that in that image, we said if you think about that as our, a picture of our world, you can slice it up. And as you slice up the sociogram, you have different component parts or platforms, I like to refer to them, as places where we build social capital. And so by identifying people's and discovering people's interests, we now have some thoughts about creating a platform or finding a platform where that person might feel comfortable. Okay? So community is more than geography. It's more than just a place. And given today with virtual reality, many of us are on social media platforms where we sort of, relate to them almost like communities. I see things, if I look at Facebook, I see people actually saying good night to their Facebook friends, online. Where literally, that social media platform has become another type of community. And, I heard people brag about how many, friends they have on Facebook, people that have, agreed to relate to them virtually. So the notion of community kind of is this broader phenomena. But when you think about our work and you think about the challenge that many of us have who are on this call, and that is to support people to be successful in community by virtue of getting jobs, houses, rides, friends, things to do. Um, and we failed on that. We've been struggling and failing in that challenge. And in fact, if we were successful, you wouldn't be on this call. You would not feel a need to be on this call. You think, hey, everything's really working, but we haven't been successful. And this gets me to this Einstein quote, which I think is really powerful. Einstein said, "The significant problems we face today, however you might want to define them, cannot be solved at the same level we were at when we created the problem or when we discovered the problem." Right? What Einstein is talking about here is a paradigm shift, right? And so many of us on this call today have been spending years thinking about and trying to facilitate that people with disabilities be successful in community, and we struggle. And that gets me to really begin to say, well, what paradigm are we using? Can we see that problem from another perspective, from a macro perspective, from a community perspective? And so, with that in mind, let me also segue with a quote from Dr. Margaret Mead. Dr. Mead, anthropologist, phenomenal, iconic anthropologist, suggests that if we are to achieve a richer culture, richer in contrasting values, Mead was of the ilk that really believed that what created richness was diversity. We must recognize the whole gamut of human potentiality. And so to weave a less arbitrary social fabric, one which in each diverse human gift we find a fitting place, right? What Margaret Mead is really speaking to here is that notion of diversity, and that our lives get better when we begin to meet and engage with people who are different from us. And what is even better is when we meet and engage with those people who are different from us around something that we have in common. So that notion of finding places and spaces and really beginning to think about how those places can be more engaging. Um, the the one thing that comes out in this particular quote to me as well is a construct called of cultural humility. And the construct of cultural humility is one that suggests that the culture that you come from, which is yours, you grew up in, and you understand from your growing, is just one culture of many that are out there as possibilities, and that no one culture is better than another culture. And when we begin to find those frameworks of commonality, and then we bring those multiple cultures together, much as Mead suggests in this quote, we weave a less arbitrary social fabric, right? We really find a diverse social fabric. Now, there's two ways that we can begin to use a community mapping in our work. Right? The one phase or the one approach is called inside out. Right? It's an inside out approach, and that is you start with a target person, identify their interests, then explore the community for some kind of a match. Right? Once you identify that match, you codify it, catalog it, embed it into a database. Right? So that's an inside out. So this is an approach, for example, that we would say Ole was moving to Pittsburgh to come to a real hockey town, and he and so he moved to Pittsburgh, but he didn't know anyone, and so I and I would work with Ole. I would say, okay, let's find out what your interests are, and then we'll look at the community of Pittsburgh and see if we can find a match, and we'll get you connected there, right? So we'll map the community, try to find something that matches what Ole is interested in or likes, and then guide him there, right? That's inside out. Now, there is an outside in perspective as well that organizations have used, and I've coached organizations on developing an outside in perspective, which is essentially you start by mapping the community. You start first by uncovering resources in the community, and then you catalog those resources that you found in the community, and then you see which one matches the people you support, right? So you start with the community, you identify all the places and spaces that are out there, and then you match that with somebody you serve, right? So that notion of inside out or outside in, I recommend kind of a hybrid approach to organizations. And I suggest that you should do both, right? That is, you should always be on the lookout in your community for resources that are there, uncovered. And you should be cataloging that. You should be capturing it, identifying it, and getting it into some kind of a database. But equally, if you're working with somebody who's interested in something specific, you should be hunting for that for them as well, right? So in the process of community mapping, when you start going out there and looking for things, you should be collecting as many resources as you come into or as you bump into, even though they may not be used by the person that you're looking for the resource for, right? I know with my staff at our agency, we always ask people to continue to, once they find something in their community, maybe something they were using or something they were personally interested in or something that they heard about, get that into our database so that if we happen to meet somebody or somebody gets referred to our organization, and we have the conversation with them about what they're interested in, we might have something that already matches for them in our database. So there's those two options, inside out, outside in, really, I think function best as a hybrid. Okay. Now, what is community mapping? And you know what, this is actually an academic construct. It's been out there for a number of years. It essentially initiated through community development agendas, mostly from a civic point of view, right? And so community mapping has been out there for us. In fact, there's wonderful programs at various universities really around the world that teach community mapping and enhance proficiencies in that. But community mapping is a process by which we come to discover the elements of a community. It results in identifying, listing these places and spaces, and cataloging them or coordinating them in some formal fashion. In the truest sense of the word, community mapping identifies not just formal resources, but also informal resources. And a formal resource is one that's structured, that's formalized, maybe bylaws, rules, regulations, dues, maybe funding in some way might be a part of that. Those are more formal, community, community aspects, but also informal elements of community. People who just kind of hang around at Tim Hortons every morning, or people who just gather at taverns or cafes, right? And they chit chat and whatnot. In my own community, there's a hardware store, and it's run by this really interesting eccentric guy named Jimmy. And Jimmy in his hardware, Jimmy is a opera aficionado, so he has opera, areas blasting, in the hardware store, which is an interesting, juxtaposition in and of itself. Hardware supplies, opera, hardware supplies, opera. Sometimes those two things don't seem to go together, but there are guys who come and hang out at Jimmy's Hardware, and he set up a little coffee urn, and there's some chairs, and these are retired sages in our community who just kind of go and hang out there at Jimmy's Hardware. And when a customer comes in with a problem, something broken, their dishwasher, their garbage disposal, the sages will diagnose it. They'll sort of look at it, or they'll probe, and they'll make recommendations, right? And this is just nobody has, it's not a formal club. It doesn't have bylaws or any of that kind of stuff. It's just a group of people who gather, right? So when we talk about community, what I want to do is I want to take off blinders, and I want you to think in a really open fashion about how these places and spaces that I'm going to go over with you might in fact fit somehow, some way into your agenda, which might be to get somebody a job, or get somebody a place to stay, or get somebody a lifestyle, and think more dynamically about community. Okay? So here's the mapping steps, right? The process of community mapping. So what we do is define the community that we're interested in. We convene a group of people with the challenge of mapping that community. We get that group organized, we get them gelling, we give them assignments, right? We select an inventory methodology. How are we going to measure this community? We're going to use some forms. We're going to survey it. We're going to ask people on the street. Are we going to, Google things? What are we going to do to find resources in community? Once we agree on a methodology, we start the process, gathering information, right? And once we gather the information, we bring it back for database codification, right? We want to basically get this information into a database. And that database codification can be a software oriented database, or it could be a scrapbook, for God's sakes. It doesn't have to be something elaborate. You could identify in a scrapbook the component parts that we're exploring. Okay? Then once we've begun to develop the database, we begin to activate a plan to impact whatever our target group is, whatever group we're attempting to help, or whatever person we're attempting to help with the community-based information that we gather. So this process is a classic, process of community mapping. I pulled this, by the way, out of Northwestern University in Chicago, has a wonderful program called ABCD, asset-based community development. And they've developed some really wonderful manuals and prototypes. I have a beautiful manual. It's up in my office. It's called Building Community from the Inside Out. And it's basically a manual that walks you through the mapping process. Now, there are key dimensions of community, and we're going to get into this in a minute, but I wanted to pause right now for our first possible questions that you might have posed as we've been going through some of this initial community mapping content. And so I just wondered, Oli, if there's anything that might have cropped up in the chat room, any questions or comments that people might have had in that first segment of community mapping content.
Yes, thanks, Al. There's a question from Lisa who is asking, do you feel that community can also serve as an antidote to neglect and criminality?
Read the question again? Do I
Sure.
feel
That community can also serve as an antidote to neglect and criminality.
I'm not exactly sure what Lisa means by an anecdote or
Antidote? Antidote? I might be
as an
mispronouncing it.
antidote. Oh, yeah. The antidote. I absolutely it is to neglect and criminality, for sure. In fact, many major cities around the world have really looked at the whole mapping process in an effort to, in fact, deal with some of the negative things that unfold in community, gangs and crime and drugs and some of the other kinds of things that can really be challenging to the community. That there are assets in community um, that can actually fight those things by bringing people together. So, Lisa, you're correct. That community and community building is an antidote to some of those negative things, just like it's an antidote to loneliness and isolation. Very, very similar. So, absolutely. Are there any other question, Oli?
No, but I was just going to chime in and say, I
Yes,
think we've
sure.
had a past conversation around that and kind of flipping that around when someone is vulnerable and lacking community sometimes they've tried to fill that void. And if that void is, an element, may include an element of criminality, getting
Right.
involved with a gang or a group of people who might
Yes.
lead to some trouble.
Absolutely. In fact, Oli, gangs are another place for building social capital. People looking for other people, that longing to be somebody, something, can happen in negative ways as well as in positive ways. And so there's no question that social capital is kind of like a neutral phenomena, and it's neutral in the fact that it could be good or bad, or it could go from a good to a bad perspective. So, I mean, even in criminology today, there's a lot of focus on penal systems and how penal systems basically extract people from community and collect them with other people in a penal colony, and then expect when the person gets released after they've done their time, why recidivism is so high, why people end up back in the penal system. And there's some really innovative folks in criminology that are saying that the real secret to getting to squashing recidivism is to build social capital, asset-based social capital, for people as they're being released from prison, and even before they're being released from prison, so that they have a positive impact with other people, rather than to get sucked right back into the negative element of social capital. So, absolutely. Okay, well, let's flip into a little bit more content, and I want to go through this stuff in a way that will maybe expand your thinking. I want to try to pull out some further thinking about community, because when we think about the dimensions of community, there's a lot of component parts, right? There's associations and clubs, there's institutions, there's groups, both formal and informal, as we mentioned earlier. There's indoor and outdoor space. There's physical things that are intentional. There are physical things that are more commercial, that can host groups and clubs of people. There's a local economy that undergirds all of this, and there are individuals who feed it. So, with those in mind, I wanted to begin to kind of begin to drill down on this. So, let's look first at associations. And by the way, this list is not exhaustive, it doesn't include everything. I'm sure there are some things in your community that could be added to this, but this is a start, at least, to kind of get the thinking of what's in my community, what's out there as a possible place where people that we care about and support might find some commonality with other people, right? So there are animal care groups and business organizations like, JCs, or Better Business Bureaus, charitable groups, nonprofit groups, that have all kinds of agendas, right? Civic event groups. Every community has some civic agenda, and oftentimes that civic agenda is highlighted by a festival of some sort, or a gathering, a formal gathering. I know here in Pittsburgh we have a big um, arts festival called the Three Rivers Arts Festival, and it runs in June throughout the city of Pittsburgh. And the festival is really, I mean, they work on the festival year round, and there are committees and groups that are part of carrying the festival out. And the minute the festival ends, the planning begins for next year. We have a big regatta that we do in August, right? Using our three rivers. And the regatta is also similar to the arts festival. It's this huge community celebration. And and the planning, there's subcommittees and there's groups that all work on various parts of those kinds of civic events. It doesn't matter how big or how small your community is. There's some civic aspects that we could uncover. There's churches. Churches are amazing resources in community because not only do they have their own, sect oriented things that they do, Bible reading or this or that, but they also serve as community resources by making space available to other groups that meet in that community. They serve the community. They feel that they have an obligation to serve the community. It doesn't matter what the theology specifically is. There's educational groups. Colleges and universities have a whole variety of levels of educational groups that have some impact with them. Elderly support groups, and we know that the senior elements of any community is a powerful one. The In the United States, we have the AARP, right? The American Association of Retired People. And the AARP is a national organization with its primary agenda to end loneliness, to eliminate loneliness. That's what they're focusing on. And then there are environmental groups about the air, about the land, about the waters, that meet and welcome. They're happy to welcome other people who might want to join them in their cause. But it's not just associations, you have institutions in community. And all of these institutions bring all kinds of possible subcomponent parts to community. Schools, both public and parochial schools, are now becoming more more relevant to their greater community physically. They're staying open longer. They're making resources available in a more generic way to the community. Universities and colleges, and especially community colleges, are places that have their own curriculum and they have their own clubs, groups, and associations, but they also host other other groups using their space, having meetings there and gatherings there. Hospitals, libraries. Libraries are really amazing places for community and for community vibrancy. Because if I don't know if you've been to a library recently, but libraries, are so much more than just lending books or borrowing books. They now, computers, and they host things, and newcomers to community. Libraries are essential items. In New York City, the libraries play a critical role in habituating newcomers to the city of New York, and helping people begin to blend in and become a part of that community. Social service agencies and nonprofit agencies, equally. I know my own organization. We began to, when we started to awaken to the importance of community, we really decided that our center was not, that we weren't going to essentially just use it as a center where our staff kind of came and go, but to really make it a community resource, to make it available. We took our name off the building. We put up Community Service Center, and we opened up to clubs, groups, and associations that shared some of the geography of where our center was located, to have it as theirs. Um, museums, museums are really, I mean, the not only what the museum itself does and exhibits that it has and things that it displays, but also the learning and the volunteer possibilities and the educational possibilities in museums is amazing. I know in Winnipeg, the amazing human rights museum that you have there. That it just when I visited there, it just kind of blew my mind. What a incredible resource that was for your community, not just in terms of sensitizing and educating, but also kind of walking the walk. Being a place where people can gather and be respected and welcomed in that gathering. Police and fire departments, again, are transitioning to community agenda. We talk about community policing these days, and it sometimes takes bad things to make some shifts. But with the George Floyd murder that happened in Minneapolis, a lot of police departments are rethinking their role of not only what do they do, but what can they be in their communities. We have clubs and groups that also are part and parcel of community. At book clubs, at Chapters Bookstore, book clubs that meet informally at a cafe or at a tavern. Um, Special interest groups that gather around something unique to them and where they gather and what they gather about. Coffee clatches, we talked about the Tim Hortons, the guys that come to Tim Hortons and sit and have coffee every morning. Similar kind of phenomena. Block clubs in various neighborhoods, religious clubs, affinity groups of all different types, and leagues, not just sports leagues, but leagues that constitute other interest areas. So the junior league and this group and that group, and their community is just a vibrant place for these things to begin to unfold. And then just the physical space of community requires a word here, that there's outside space in every community, and then there's commercial realities of community that are there for us to analyze and to think about and to examine. Do people gather here? Gardens and parks and playgrounds and bike paths and these kinds of things. Dog parks, where people go with their dog every night, let the dogs roam around in the park, and people just kind of that have an interest in dogs hang out and talk, right? So how we might begin to not only know our communities, but begin to think about what role can they play for our agenda of trying to get people engaged. On the other side of this, bookstores and cafes, community centers are just amazing resources. Rec centers. I think I might have told the story last week about work I did with Community Living Mississauga with their rec center in Mississauga, which is in bedroom community of Toronto, and the rec center in Mississauga, they're really robust. They've got lots of stuff going on, and Community Living Mississauga, who support people with disabilities, really reached out and started a dialogue with the rec center, and that dialogue was we have lots of people who would love to take part in some of the things that you guys do. We don't want to recreate the wheel. We'd like to support you in being more inclusive in what you do in the rec center. And the rec center was really open to this. They wanted, more people to take advantage of, the resources they had. And so what we did through Community Living Mississauga is we started to sensitize the staff at the rec center to inclusivity, right? And the ways for being more, more hospitable. And rather than see somebody who comes in there with a disability as well, we really are not for you. You can go to Community Living Mississauga. They take care of people like you, to really begin to say, hey, we do recreation and we do it for everybody. And so the notion of our being a support to vitalize our community in doing what they should have been doing all along is really part of the macro agenda here, right? That's part of the community building agenda, is that we should not be all things to all people with disabilities. That rather we should unlock the potential of our generic community to do the things that they typically do for everybody, right? And so the local economy of a community also presents and provides some piece of this puzzle, right? Because the notion of of businesses being more vibrant because their business now becomes more inclusive, more people take advantage of the business, and our role is to really help business take care of all people, who are interested in that particular business. And merchants, the same kind of a thing. Um, I I know that some communities have done some really interesting things with merchants around inclusivity. First, with accessibility, right? Physical accessibility, and then with attitudinal accessibility, so that all people in community could shop or celebrate in community typically, right? And foundations in community are really interested in this. I think there's resources to be had for us um, in community foundations to help communities become more diverse and more inclusive. And rather than the community to think about disability in a box that is placed somewhere else, the community thinks about opening its gifts up to everybody in that community. So I think there's as many possibilities here as your creative mind lets you begin to think about. Okay? Now, with that in mind, here's a couple more thoughts about places and spaces in community that might play some kind of a role that some people that we support or and know might somehow, some way engage, right? Daycare centers are always looking for volunteers and people willing to help. Art galleries, bowling alleys, historical societies, restaurants and community-based organizations in some way, shape, or form. All of these kind of pieces of the puzzle, there might be some point of intersection between our agenda of full inclusive community and for people to participate in what community offers, as well as to get people connected to clubs, groups, and associations. So the spirit of community engagement is really one where I think our primary agenda should be to be a catalyst for a better Manitoba, a better Winnipeg, a better Pittsburgh, a better Pennsylvania, right? That our job is not to get referrals of people with disabilities and get bigger, and it's really to find that intersection with the greater community and to really facilitate that people who have been separated out or left behind or isolated or disconnected for some we therapeutic reason to be repatriated with their like-minded brothers and sisters in community. So I want to pause now for a second round, Oli, of any questions or comments. We just went through a whole litany of resources for people to sort of think about, and just wanted to see if there were any questions that arose or any comments that people might have made on that segment of of content.
Yeah, there are a few comments. A couple came in right when we were just kind of moving on to the next section. So Jill chimed in with lack of community could also affect people so negatively that a person has such a wanting for human connection that they may look for relationships in ways where they do not realize they're being lied to or taken advantage of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's not just true for people with disabilities. That could be true for any lonely person. Any lonely person um, can really be taken advantage of. In fact, I think last week when we talked about this, I mentioned that in the UK, there was a member of parliament by the name of Joe Cox who was young and vibrant, uh, active politically in her community, and was brutally murdered. And the members of parliament just could not believe how someone like Joe Cox could be murdered. And as they began investigating, they discovered in Joe Cox's personal material, her diary, that that showed how lonely she was, that she was just reaching out in any way she could to try to connect, and she ended up, in this, bad situation that actually ended her life. So I think the was it Joe who made that point on
Um,
in the or Jill.
Jill, yeah,
Jill.
Jill.
So Jill, Jill's absolutely correct that literally, um, loneliness can cause people to go down the wrong routes. No question. Next comment, Oli, is
Yeah, the next one was from Rick, and I think it was kind of adjacent to our back and forth around criminality and the comments about gangs. Addictions are like that too. They go back to their friends, and it is hard to avoid participating.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
It's our focus here today obviously is disability, but there's no question that these ancillary struggles, social struggles, um, that social capital plays a role in addressing these at any level for any group at risk or any group that's struggling right now. Clearly, when someone gets into the swirl of addiction, um, that the social capital that they develop in that world can continue to pull them down. And then it's really social capital outside of that world that really is the lifeline for people to pull themselves out. So there's no question that the applicability of the stuff we're talking about today and that we talked about last week is, it plays out in so many different ways in community. Anything else, Ollie, in the comment section before we roll on to the next element of
Sure.
content?
Yeah, there are a few more comments, so I'm not sure if we'll get to all of them, but
No,
let's
no,
give it a
just
whirl.
one or
So,
two more, and then we'll get back
sure.
in.
So Ina's comments on something we touched on last week a little bit. She says, I'd like to highlight that inclusion has to be at the forefront of engaging with communities because what we see is the use of communities for groups that all have a disability. There are clubs just for people with a disability. And in employment, this has been reproduced, at least in Ontario, by what is called entrepreneurs' businesses. I think the core issue, that, as I understand it, and like she's saying, like if our ham-handed response is to build segregated communities solely, if that's our sole focus, that's problematic. So, Inez, I hope I'm
Absolutely.
representing your your thoughts there correctly.
Yeah. One more. One more comment.
Sure. Well, Carrie chimes in with, "How would you engage merchants?"
Yeah. Carrie, that's great. That's a great question. And I think you engage merchants with what they are interested in, and that is selling a product or continuing to address whatever their merchandising to a community, right? And so there's no question that with inclusivity comes additional customers, right? And and that's not abstract. I mean, that is very tangible. And if a merchant can be more welcoming to a broader audience, more people will take advantage of what they are selling. So I think that there's a very direct connection of dots between inclusivity and retail success or merchandising success. Um, and I mean, there's also the other piece of this, and that is doing the right thing and being kind of a champion for folks who have been devalued and marginalized, and you know you could go that route in some ways too. But I think, just really hitting the nail right on the top of the head is that, diversity is just good business. It brings, I mean, it's interesting to see some of this play out in the culture wars that are happening in the United States, right? Where you have right wing reaction to Disney World, um, having Gay Pride Day or opening itself up to inclusivity, where you get some right thinking people, right being politically to the right, um, that see that as kind of a bad thing, or and try to limit Disney from being more inclusive. And Disney, even by virtue of some of their films and some of their characters, that they're really looking to be inclusive with. I mean, even something like Finding Nemo, where Nemo himself was, had a disability. He was missing a fin, and and the nature of trying to just weave this fabric of community, that everyone is welcome. So there's some political pushback that's happening with some of that, but I think it's just good business. Bud Light marketing itself to the queer and gay communities by virtue of some influencer pitching it that and then this right wing reaction to that. It's sad to see that, but those folks will be on the ash heap of history at some point, unfortunately, and it's just a matter of recognizing that we live in a diverse world, and that our diversity is a strength, not a liability. Okay, let's get back into content. We'll open up for more questions as we move, or more comments as we move forward. But the notion now of taking some of this and really beginning to incorporate it, to use it. How do we map a community? What is what are some of the methodologies that we could utilize in getting a better handle on what's in our community? Okay? And so the notion of how do we find what's in community, there's a number of different ways that we can proceed, right? In many communities, there's already printed materials that are readily available, easily available, about what exists in that community. There's already people who've done some mapping of various subsectors of community. Part of our goal is to let's find that information and let's take a look at it and then see what needs to be added to. You can do a Google search, just a simple Google. I was on the phone earlier today with some colleagues, some friends of mine that I'm doing some work with at Community Living Kingston in Ontario, and focusing on on a more inclusive Kingston, and that and so they sent me some information on someone that they're supporting, and I took a look at this, and then one of the things that this person was really interested in was gardening, right? Gardening. And so I just Googled, gardening groups in Kingston, Ontario. Just a simple Google search. And I would encourage you to just try this as well. Just say, if somebody that you're supporting is interested in, I don't know, music of some certain type of music, or they're interested in cooking or whatever, just Google that and put in your hometown, whatever your hometown might be, and see what comes up. Some of this is already captured in the information in effort that's happening with search engines today. They're identifying all kinds of stuff that are out there, and we should take advantage of it. In fact, meetup.com, which is on this slide in the third bullet, is a social networking website, right? If you go to meetup.com, the homepage will ask you, where do you live and what are you interested in? And if you put that information into a keyword search and hit enter, up comes all kinds of possible resources geographically ordered by virtue of your postal code to where you live, right? So if I was moving to Winnipeg, and I put in jazz music, right? Because I like jazz music in Winnipeg, you're going to get lots of hits, right? If I go to meetup.com, I might find some clubs or groups that gather around jazz, right? And inviting me to join them, right? And that's why they're on meetup.com, is they want to welcome other people to meet up with them who like the same thing. Equally, you can actually start a meetup group. If you're, say you're interested in, Italian recipes, I'm going to create a meetup club around Italian recipes. I could put something on the meetup with that in mind. And if somebody's searching, on Meetup and they happen to put Italians, and that I might, my group might come up, right? So there are these search engines that are out there, but the most basic search engine is talking to another person, right? And observing community, just looking around. If you were, if for every community has a sage or sages who know everything that's going on. In my community of McKees Rocks, there's a guy who runs an Italian sausage place. He sells sausage, hot sausage, and meatballs, and fresh pasta. His name is Ernie Ritchie. And Ernie knows everybody, and he knows everything that's going on in McKees Rocks, right? And and so if I'm looking for something, or I stop and ask Ernie, he's got at least an idea for me about where to go and what to do. So recognize that there's all this possibility out there in finding information in community, and that a lot of this is interconnected, right? So what Oli knows, somebody who knows what I'm in need of, right? So that interconnectedness, that interdependence that we oftentimes talk about is a part and parcel to vibrant community building. So if we're going to begin to do this, here's some of the things that I recommend you think about, right? And I'm going to show you some templates that will help with this. But what you want to discover when you're looking at community is, if when you find a group, even if it's intentional, you find it because it's intentional, it's the inside out approach. Or if it's the outside in approach, you just bump into this community group, identify the group, identify the location of the venue they use to gather, identify how often do they gather, even if you can, by virtue of observation or maybe even conversation, what's expected of people who come to this group. Who might be a possible gatekeeper, or somebody who would open the gates and welcome someone new in? Any contact information, emails, phone numbers, anything that might, addresses that might be vital, and any other pertinent information that there's parking available, it's on a bus line, it's, that's whatever might be relevant to the group. This is the kind of information we're looking to gather. Now, here's one template that I want to show you that we've used in other places where I've been working with groups to do community mapping, right? And this is an overview sheet, right? So basically, it identifies public spaces that exist, and just going through the effort of identifying how many parks are there in this community where the person I support lives. Are there gardens there? Any swimming pools or rec centers? What are some of the other kind of libraries? So this just kind of gives you some way of putting some some girth to the notion of community. Here's another template. This is assessing gathering places. So a place like a church or a college or a rec center or a library, they may be, not only do they do their own things, groups sponsored by the setting, but they also might have other groups who meet there on a regular basis that they make space available to. And both of those might be resources for you, for somebody that you know and somebody you're supporting. And then here's the last template. Let me share that. This is a template we developed in a town called Hermitage, which is just a little bit south of Erie, Pennsylvania. I was working with a group up there called Whole Life. It's an agency that serves folks mostly with intellectual disabilities. And we created this form for them to assess their community. And so you can see on the top, there's some descriptive information, right? And then um, down below where it says check all impressions that apply, they tried to make it easier to do just a checklist so that there wasn't a whole lot of onerous writing. And so they would check off if there's parking available, if it's accessible. And then on the right hand side, you see they also pulled together some impressions, right? When they went to visit, did they feel welcomed? Was it warm? Did it seem regimented? Were people tolerant there? Right? They were looking for some keys that could be utilized in identifying people they serve who might be successful in that venue. So there's a number of different ways that you can shape information for your purpose, right? Whatever your purpose might specifically be. Okay. And then once the information is gathered, we're at the point of how do you display it? How do you use it so you can manage it? Right. And so here we have, at Hermitage, because of the intellectual disabilities of many of the folks that they support, rather than put things in a database, they created scrapbooks. And the scrapbooks were kind of simple, very concrete, different groups, and they had pictures from both real pictures from the group, as well as descriptive pictures that they found from stock, and essentially we're able to sit down with somebody in a kind of non-threatening, comfortable way and really look at some of the things that that person might want to do in the community. In some cases, you actually can put stuff on a map with pins. In many civic uses of community mapping, there's the pin process that's used. So the benefits of community mapping, right? And the key benefit here is that mapping will reveal possible targets, places and spaces that people you support might be able to go to and become members of, right? So once you have the target, once the resource is found, connections can follow once that person begins to engage there. And then once the person becomes a member and they begin to engage there, you're beginning to set the table for a possible relationship. Doesn't mean the relationships are going to happen. It just means it's possible that they might happen. I can guarantee you this: if people don't go to any place, relationships are never going to happen. I mean, I can guarantee that. So here, this sets the table for relationships. And once people begin to build relationships, those good things start to happen. Many of those good things that we talked about last time we met. And so Burton Blatt said, since the beginning of the human experience, people have behaved as if freedom means more to them than their life. Yet even more important to people has been the need to belong to community. Dr. Blatt was at Syracuse University, one of the pioneers of inclusivity. And this is just a powerful notion because, we think freedom is this big deal. More important is belonging. Albert Schweitzer famously said, the first step in the evolution of ethics in a community, in a society, in a nation is a sense of solidarity with the other people, right? Solidarity creates this kind of connectedness. Similarities connect, right? And connection is the very first stage of relationship building. Got to connect first, and then you can begin to try to build that relationship. Robert Putnam, his book was called Bowling Alone. Harvard sociologist opined, and probably one of the biggest purveyors of social capital in the world, said if you belong to no community and you decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying in half over the next year. And Putnam actually showed this. He verified it by virtue of data, right? So we know community is good for people. We know it's where relationships are found. We know it's where vibrancy is, right? And we know that it's out there. We see it. Every one of us on this phone call today, on this Zoom call, connect in some ways to our community, in some routine ways to our community. And the stuff we get from that is immeasurable in terms of how important it is to our life success. And so community is this kind of puzzle. It's challenging. They're like any puzzle, it's challenging. But as you begin to fit the pieces together, it makes sense. It comes alive. It begins to pay the dividends that you're looking for and that you want. And so here's my contact information, as I always kind of give to you guys in when we do these sessions. And I put this out there because if people want to engage, privately, and don't want to necessarily, do something on a Zoom presentation, that's fine, and I'm always happy to connect with you. I also put up my website so that if you're looking to dig into some other material or deeper material on this, you might want to navigate through the website. I have some videos and I have some resources. I also have some chapters or sections from books I've written that are downloadable that you can gather off the website. Um, but what I'd like to do now is I'd like to segue, and I'd like to pose a question to you to think about and maybe react to um, in the chat room. We're not looking for an onerous response. And we also, maybe you might even just raise your hand on the little Zoom hand raising button. And, we can speak even, just verbally about the question. Okay. So let me pose this question to you. And so let me give this. Give some examples of your experience with informal social venues. If you can identify the informal venues that you either have participated in or know about, give some examples of an informal venue that you either know about or maybe participate in, or someone has participated that you know. Um, Informal, okay? We're not looking at formal club that you joined. You paid, you paid dues, and we're talking about informal community now. Give one example if you can. And if you don't want to put it in the chat room, just raise your hand, and Oli will kind of look through and we'll see if we can identify someone to actually talk this out with us. An informal social venue that you've either participated in or somebody you know has, and it has been helpful.
Oh, would you like me to read them as they come in?
Yeah, please.
Sure, okay. Anne talks about an informal coffee clutch that meets monthly for adults with autism at a local Tim's.
Okay, nice.
Pamela says there's an MLA who is at McDonald's every Saturday. So an MLA is our provincial, local kind of legislative representative, basically.
Okay. Mhm.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Matt chimes in, outdoor hockey rinks and community centers. Ashley chimes in with mall walkers.
Hmm. Yeah, there you go. That's great. That's a great example.
Andrea chimes in that there's a group of people that meet Saturdays at the Forks to play chess. The Forks is where
Nice.
our two rivers, primary rivers, meet in Winnipeg.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Lynn suggests the library book club. Rick chimes in. He says, we play hacky sack at the university most Sundays. Everyone is welcome. We invite passersby to join in, and a few do.
That's great. That's great.
That's pretty cool. Inez suggests a boxing club.
Hmm.
Allison references a garden plot, like a community garden plot.
Nice. Nice. People just kind of informally show up and help out. Yeah. Yeah.
Michael talks about a dog park.
Yeah. Good example there.
Yeah. Jill suggests running and bike paths. Tammy talks about pickup soccer games, walking club at our local athlete park. And talks about a group of ladies in the lap swim at one of our local community indoor pools, who
Nice.
don't lap swim but have an area blocked off in the deep end where they can tread water and chat for the whole lap swim.
It's great.
That's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah.
Uh, Local community, Dana suggests local community center groups of parents that gather at the fence to pick up or drop off children at school. Also, the local toboggan hill. Kaylee chimes in with walking around the block with our dogs. We end up talking with all of the neighbors. I notice that all the time. The people walking dogs have no shortage of people to talk to,
That's exactly
including other
correct.
people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That
Uh,
these are all really, really good versions of informal community, and the camaraderie that comes in these gatherings uh, transcend the reason for gathering, and that therein I think lies the, I guess, the secret sauce of community, right? Because our interests are the specific things that might guide us to people are really incidental to the people that we meet once we get there, right? It's more important to be with people than even the things that are happening, or the things about the group. Um, I I belong to an informal group. It's called the Social Capital Social Justice Conversation Group. That's the name of it. And it was just a name we gave to it. We started it probably 12, 13 years ago. And it was just a group of people who were interested in the social justice issues in Pittsburgh, right? And we started to meet once a month. Just once a month we would meet. And it was at Panera's. We met at a like a little coffee shop kind of place that have these rooms available where you can gather. And my knee-jerk reaction with that group was to do something. I wanted to have the group do something. We got together for maybe 5, 6 months, and we were talking about things. I said, well, let's do something. Let's promote social justice in Pittsburgh. Let's sponsor a conference. Let's do a World Cafe. Let's somehow, and I had this urge to formalize the group, and other members of the group resisted that. And they said, no, no. we don't want to necessarily, we're doing things in other places we want to just talk. We want to get other people's opinion on things. We want to, have a safe place where we can really vent if we need to. And so that's what the group, and I said to myself, this group is not going to last, right? Because if you don't do something, it's it's then like what's the point, but I missed the point, because the point was being with other people. That was the point. And I learned my lesson in that experience, that people gather more to be with other people than for the reason of the gathering. And herein, I think, is really the secret for us, because a lot of the men and women we support are not as sophisticated, right? They may not have the sophisticated either social experiences or vocational experiences, or but they want to be with people, right? They want to be a part of something, right? And that's at the core of community gathering. And so that this notion of community mapping is really an effort to begin to say, where are some of those places? And now here's the downside of community mapping, and that is that the things come and go, especially informal things come and go. But even formal things, look at the pandemic, how many things actually ended when the pandemic unfolded and we could not go, right? And there were some groups that were able to transition to Zoom or virtual platforms, but a lot of other groups couldn't and didn't, and they just ended, right? So in community mapping, the other thing we need to be cognizant of and willing to commit to is keeping things current, right? So if we develop a database, that has to be tended to. We have to make sure that as something goes out of fashion or out of business, that we pull it from our database. And as new things come into fruition, we add those into our database. So databases have to be managed. And does that take some time, and that takes some commitment to do that. Um, Also, I think there's some other general features of community mapping that would be attractive in a variety of ways. For example, newcomers coming to Winnipeg, somebody who's moving to Winnipeg for the first time, some kind of a community map that identifies resources and places and spaces, that would be just a wonderful tool to have, right? That would be immigrants who are moving, to a new nation. Having something like a community map is like a gold mine, right? To other people. Um, Anyone who has ever gone to a new community knows the struggle of getting a ledge hold in that community. It's not easy. And so having these kind of resources might, and why I mention that is that there might be some possibilities that if your organization decides they want to get involved in a mapping project, that maybe partnering with the community leaders, with the mayor, with elected leaders, with government officials, might be able to not only partner with you, but there may be some resources brought to bear. Foundations, community foundations love ideas like this, because these are things that, build community from the inside out. They build community up. So I think that although there are some liabilities, you got to keep the map, fresh. You have to keep the map timely. Um, there's also the other side of the coin, and that is this map is not just something that would help your agency. It's something that could help others in your community generally benefit from. Okay? So what I thought we'd do is kind of open it up now, Oli, to any questions or comments, either things that were in the chat room previously, or any fresh either questions or comments that folks might have um, on this topic, the topic of community mapping. And we can use the chat room, or we can again use the wave of the hand and just the actual dialogue. And we have about 15 minutes left, so we have some time here to dive into some thoughts or questions, or maybe issues, problems that you see or have with some of this that we can talk more about. So let me open that up to let's open it up to dialogue. And only if there's anything in the chat room to start with, we can start there, and then if people have some questions, they could just raise their hands. You're muted, Oli.
There we go. Sorry about that. A couple more suggestions. Someone suggested local running places will have a free group runs. Ice fishing on one of our rivers. There's a bit of a community there. You can show off your big fish with
Yeah.
the others who are fishing. And I'm just going backwards to look at some of the comments. Oh, there's anyone there. Oh, Megan's suggesting populate your own map, host a barbecue, organize a garage sale, start a hobby club. So you can
Yeah.
be the person who's building the group rather than the person seeking out the group.
Great idea,
Absolutely.
Megan.
So bear with me. Um, just going back a ways, Joy was talking about living in a rural community or area and understanding the need to map a wider area. But part of the mapping might have to do with, transportation isn't readily available in these communities where people are spread out more. So some of the mapping might have to be kind of associated with transportation options too.
Absolutely. That's that. Yeah,
And
yeah, Joy. Let me just
yeah,
pause on that. That's a great
okay.
point that you're making about rural areas and transportation and the notion of maybe some combined effort that people can come up with that would begin to address some of the transportation void that exists, carpooling and other kinds of ways that people might weigh in to try to lessen some of those more rural struggles, and transportation being one of the primary ones. So great point on that. Thanks for sharing that.
And Pamela chimed in with that too. She said there may be retired groups, uh, retired people who are looking to build their own kind of social connections who might also be willing to volunteer to help with some of the transportation.
Right. Yeah, 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 absolutely.
So I'm hopping around a little bit just to look. I think there have been a few fresh new comments. Rick chimes in. I'm in love with community gardens as cultural social hubs. I'd like to see them used intentionally this way. Free concerts, art projects, etc. So sounds like Rick wants that to be the gathering spot, not just
Yeah.
for or not solely for gardening.
Yeah, well, Rick, that's let me just say a word about that kind of that outdoor space, that common space. Communities are now more and more investing in ways that that common space can be shared, and that people's interests can happen almost in a festival kind of a way. I know that, and Oli knows this. My band, I have a band called the Doo-Wop Doctors, and we get invited to play in all of these, community festivals that are going on, these like car shows and autumn festivals and spring festivals. And communities recognize that people like to and need to be together. And so there's there's investments that are made by community leaders in having these kinds of things. And so it's just a matter of just searching through the community to find out all these things that are going on. And who knows, when you do this, you might find something that just appeals to you personally, that there may be some real personal gain that you find as we're examining this for our agencies or for our movement toward inclusivity. You might just find something that you might take advantage of personally with your own family in your own way. Other things that are in there, Oli.
Raham, I hope I'm pronouncing your name, endorses the Meetup app as well. I don't know. Am I missing anything, anyone that you think you need to chime
Okay.
in on?
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
I'll
Great.
ask a question, Al. Like, have you seen an example? Wow, this place, this person, they are the gold standard. They have this community mapping thing figured out, and this is how they proceeded. Anything come to mind? I'm putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there are, other brother and sister organizations out there that are doing community mapping. Um, my initial recommendation on that is to really look at some of the stuff coming out of the ABCD Institute, the the Asset Based Community Development Institute in Chicago. And there's just some great examples of not only what they've done in Chicago, but also other organizations that have done community asset building. There also, I just saw on like one of the TV shows, that Boise, Idaho, the town of Boise, has created a community welcoming resource that is designed to not just welcome newcomers to Boise, but to literally have available resources for citizens of Boise to take advantage of in terms of building a stronger, more vibrant community. So I think if you Google Boise, Idaho, you can track that down. I don't have that reference right at the top of my fingertips, but and I'm working, been working with a group up in Ottawa who are looking at, this is the Ottawa Developmental Support Network, um, and they are attempting to have a community mapping project. And I did some coaching on the front end of the thinking with that, and propped up all the stuff, and then they were going to run with it. And they have 18 different organizations that are a part of this network, and each organization was going to take one sector of Ottawa, and they were going to do an outside in kind of a mapping process by looking at what's in that community and then beginning to codify that with all 18 groups and have a collective map. They were just in the early stages, though. of this unfolding. So um, the those are some off the top of cuff resources on community mapping. I can also make available some other resources that I can get to you, and maybe more. I can go back to my resource pool and then be prepared to talk more about some of those next week when we meet for our final session. And our final session, by the way, is on social infrastructure and gatekeepers. And I'm going to recommend in that session a couple possible projects to consider that are designed to soften community and the community infrastructure. And I'll have those. I'll have some information on that available to you, so that when we send the invites out, um, people can have some of that in advance. Okay, good.
Great.
Anything else popping up in the any questions before we look at adjourning? Any other final points?
Oh, Jill chimes in for Winnipeg folk. Winnipeg for Free is a great website to find free events happening in the community. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Um, I think I found, so Boise, was it called community asset mapping in Boise? Does that ring a bell?
Community asset mapping?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Pamela chimes in. She liked Rick's example about free concerts and knowing that once the weather gets nicer, there are a lot of free concerts in
Yeah.
Winnipeg
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
maybe a chance to connect with others too. Any other questions or comments anyone else has that they want to chime in on?
Yeah.
Ideas, questions?
I just want to one point that I want to underscore, and the community mapping, however you do it or whatever, inside out, outside in, um, presents possibilities for connection, right?
Correct.
They present a possible venue or setting for someone to engage in. It doesn't automatically mean that relationships are going to happen. The stuff we talk about next week, we're going to really see if we can address that. How might we promote the possibilities for people to build relationships? So, but in a kind of in a like a logical sort of framework, this sort of you find out what people like, you find places where people share that same interest. Now we're the stage is set, if you will, for a relationship to start. But that has to be massaged. That doesn't happen automatically. And any of us who have gone down, all of us have gone down the relationship trail, know that relationships are complex. They don't happen automatically. Sometimes they do happen automatically. Sometimes even when you thought for sure this was big, it bombed. So the notion of relationships, because it is so muddy, we've got to just recognize that what we're talking about now is just finding targets, potential targets. How we take advantage of those targets, and then how people fit in to those targets, become a really important ingredient before a relationship can form.
So a great reminder, we have to be intentional, purposeful, restless for that actual connection to be made. Otherwise, we could, you know, proceed with or pursue some of these, but risk almost kind of bouncing off the atmosphere
That's right.
and
That's
not
exactly
not
right. Yeah,
there are
and
some.
not just that, but that the in our work, in many cases, what's happened is people have have filled in the void. Agencies have filled in the void for people that we support, and
Yeah.
that we end up taking a couple people to the mall just to do something, to get them out of their apartment, and that what what we have to kind of always keep in our in our mind is how is this action that I'm doing right now, whatever it might be, how might this lead to a meaningful relationship for the person that I'm supporting? How we always, that litmus test always has to be there, because it can really be easily, we can easily sort of backslide here and just do something because it's easier, it's faster, it's safer, it's not as challenging. um they said they really didn't want to go. And we're trying to really, the consumer makes a decision. If they don't want to go, then we're not going to, we're going to, it's community decisions here. They make and we end up, with what we have right now, which is not good enough, which is not community inclusion. It's not full participatory community. And so I think we want to keep our eyes on that prize. We want to really stay vigilant about our actions leading to a meaningful relationship for someone. And not with us, but a meaningful relationship with somebody, that has the same interest as someone else. So with that being said, that caveat being said, let's get prepared. Next week we're back on Tuesday at 1 o'clock Central Time. We're going to be focusing in on the social infrastructure and some macro change ideas that we're going to kind of put out there. We'll use a similar format that we use today. We'll do some pausing, for some questions or some reactions that people have, as we sort of try to tie this all up into some fitted version. Know that these are being recorded. The recordings are available. Ollie will post them. So if there's somebody you wish that would have been here for this conversation, they can plug in and benefit from it, even if they weren't here for it. So let me just pass it over to you, Oli, for the final word. I just want to thank folks for their participation today. Oli?